Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors by Dr. Janina Fisher. Highly recommend this book if you want to learn about parts and the approaches of therapy. This is part 6 of my book quote reading from my Zen Mind Balcony. All quotes by Janina Fisher from Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors. The importance to free yourself of past trauma is expressed in this image. Individuals who have experienced child abuse often psychologically disown their child self, who was humiliated or mistreated, to preserve their sense of feeling okay to survive. Quote by Dr. Janina Fisher. The traumatized part of ourselves that we disown reflects our strengths as an independent human being. Seeing the parts. Externalized mindfulness. When individuals are too identified or too blended with their parts, feelings, and beliefs to access mindful observation, as is common with very dysregulated clients, therapists need other ways of facilitating dual awareness. Enough dual awareness that the normal life self develops a perspective on and a relationship with the trauma-related part, rather than blend with it. Blending keeps the trauma alive. How could any individual resolve traumatic experience in what subjectively feels like an unsafe, hostile environment? Clients and therapists alike often collude in believing that trauma can be resolved by processing the events, even when critical voices are still attacking the individual at will, using the same words or scathing tone as the perpetrator. Similarly, both may equate safety with freedom from self-harm or a non-abusive home environment, as I did when I first met Annie. It might not occur to us that a felt sense of safety is likely to be unattainable if the client is habitually blended with child parts who still feel unwelcome, frightened, or ashamed, or suicidal. Although the external environment may now be safe from an objective perspective, clients who are blended with their implicit memories and parts may have no bodily or emotional sense of safety that could reassure the parts that it is over. When we are triggered by something and our traumatized parts get activated, their feelings flood the body with intense and overwhelming feelings and impulses to act or react in ways that are not us or who we intend to be. That experience is called blending. To find our adult selves again, we need to unblend, to mindfully separate from the intense reactions of the parts until we have a felt sense of I'm here and also he or she is still here too. Before trauma can be resolved, the client must learn how to unblend from parts so that the realities of both brains can be appreciated. From an unblended dual awareness perspective, the normal life self can learn to orient to the immediate environment by focusing visual attention, can correctly evaluate the level of safety, but also feel the part's fear and bracing for danger as their evaluation. From the perspective of present reality, as I call it, the normal life part can bear witness to the part's past reality and often feel empathy for their still being there. Because it takes practice to detect when one is blended, often the therapist becomes the observer who notices blending. I can see you're really blended with the ashamed part today. It's hard not to blend with that anxious part. You're so used to insta-blending with her. Insta-blending is the term I use to describe procedurally learned habits of automatically blending with whichever parts have the strongest feeling. Often so quickly that mindful noticing doesn't catch it. To be able to identify these patterns as they happen, it is important for clients to have a language for what is happening to them that is non-interpretive and non-pathologizing, that helps them to notice potentially problematic conditioned learning. When clients identify with trauma-related parts or blend with them, they can quickly lose access to the prefrontal cortex and the normal life self. The intensity of the part's trauma responses tends to drown out a felt connection to the left brain self who can remember to grocery shop even though the freeze part is having panic attacks today. It is not surprising that the normal life self's dogged persistence in making a normal life possible comes to be interpreted as pretending or fraudulent. It is counterintuitive to conceive of a part that thinks and acts rationally and functionally despite the overwhelming sensations and emotions as reflecting an authentic self, much less a self that embodies how the client survived the years of abuse, neglect, or captivity without losing the capacity or drive to go on. Each time I point out that's your going on with normal life self, sticking with what's important, putting one foot in front of the other, no matter what. I bring the client's attention to the influence of the normal life self in their lives. I underscore the courage and instinctive drive to seek normal even in an abnormal environment. Think of it this way. The normal life self is the part of you that keeps trying to be okay even when all the other parts are freaking out. And that takes a lot of courage and determination to keep on keeping on when your parts are freaking out. A false self wouldn't have to work that hard. The normal life self has the capacity to hold in dual awareness, both past and present, part and whole, animal brain and thinking brain. However, when clients finally come for treatment, the going on with normal life self is often demoralized or depleted, identified with certain parts, and intimidated by or ashamed of others. Although the normal life part has the innate ability to learn to observe them all, to decrease autonomic dysregulation, and to become interested in, rather than afraid of, the parts. He or she may need education to recognize them as young child selves trying to communicate their trauma-related fears and phobias. Notice that the meaning-making of the therapist challenges the going on with normal life self, while at the same time expressing support for the parts. Each statement or question communicates that the therapist will be an advocate for the young, vulnerable, and traumatized. There is no emphasis on discovering what happened in the past. The focus is on the relationship between parts and normal life self. Now, what is happening between them in the present moment? There is an implicit assumption that they are driven by the experiences of the past, by painful body and emotional memories. That can be acknowledged, but no effort is made to connect the parts' reactions now to specific events then. When clients spontaneously associate a part with particular image or event, the therapist reframes the intrusion of memory as the part's way of communicating why it is afraid or ashamed or angry. Befriending our parts means that we radically accept, Linehan 1993, that we share our bodies and lives with roommates and that living well with ourselves requires living amicably, collaboratively with our all of ourselves, not just the ones with whom we feel comfortable. Self-acceptance, befriending one's parts, is not simply a therapeutic intervention. It also contributes to developing the practice of self-acceptance, one part at a time. When clients pause their emotional reactivity to befriend themselves, to be curious and interested rather than dismissing or judgmental, they slow time. Autonomic arousal settles. There is a relaxing of the sense of urgency to do or be anything different. With their bodies in a calmer state, they can be more at peace, and, as a result, their parts feel more at peace. Self-alienation, i.e., disowning of some parts and identifying with others exclusively, does not contribute to a sense of peace or well-being, even when it is absolutely necessary in order to survive. Self-alienation creates tension, pits part against part, communicates a hostile environment, often much like the traumatic environment, and diminishes the self-esteem of every part. For some, eye contact may have been a lifeline, leaving the client with little ability to disengage from staring at others. But for some individuals, eye contact might have been an aversive experience of looking into frightening eyes, resulting in habits of disengaging or looking away, later noted by therapists as poor eye contact, without awareness that habits of eye contact tell us valuable information about early attachment experiences. where clients sit closer or farther from the therapist, whether their bodies are oriented toward or away, lean toward or pull back from the therapist, already provide us with important information about the client's attachment style and history. Trauma and attachment. The source of safety becomes the source of danger. With a frightening caregiver, infants are caught in a relational trap. Their defense systems motivate them to flee from the caregiver, while at the same time their attachment system motivates them under the commanding influence of separation fear to strive for achieving comforting proximity to her or him. The result is what Main and Hesse 1990 first termed disorganized or type D attachment, the result of what Main termed fright without solution, when parents are frightened or frightening. Main and Hesse concluded the child's instinctive source of comfort and safety becomes the source of danger. Rather than attachment figures providing protection and interactive regulation for the child, their behavior is alarming, frightening. Frightened and/or abusive parents stimulate proximity-seeking drives and activate the child's survival defenses of fight and flight, or they evoke rapid activation of the parasympathetic dorsal vagal system to initiate freezing, shutting down, or playing dead. Because infants and young children dependent on their caretakers for survival cannot effectively flee or fight, their repertoire of survival responses is limited to the resources of their young bodies. Ogden et al. 2006. Driven to seek proximity to attachment figures when alarmed or hurt, they defend against threat by backing away, closing their eyes, hiding, shutting down, or dissociating. When the source of danger is the attachment figure, the mind and body must find a way to maintain an attachment bond while simultaneously mobilizing animal defense survival responses to protect the child. These two powerful innate drives, to attach and to defend, each remain highly activated, one drive dominating at times and then the other. Liotti describes it in the context of frightening caregiving. The caregiver becomes, at the same time, the source and the solution of the infant's alarm. Fear comes to paradoxically coexist in the infant's experience with the soothing provided by proximity to the caregiver. Phobia of therapy and the therapist. This legacy of disorganized attachment and controlling strategies affects all later adult relationships, including the therapeutic one. Wanderhart, Nienhuis, and Steele call this latter phenomenon phobia of therapy and the therapist. To the extent that traumatized clients come to therapy craving the relief, understanding, and care offered by the therapist, proximity seeking, they are equally likely to experience fear and distrust of both the relationship and the process, either early in treatment or as the relationship with the therapist grows. The lived experience of traumatized individuals has created an unavoidable and painful paradox. Closeness cannot be trusted, but distance or aloneness is also not safe. Their experience was that being alone and without protection created greater vulnerability, while being in proximity was also not safe, because they could not depend upon the protection of the non-offending caretaker. These clients are either loath to depend upon the therapist, or they assume the opposite, that their only safety lies in dependency. Rather than feeling comforted by the therapeutic relationship or by the growing closeness that usually occurs as a natural, healthy outgrowth of psychotherapy, the attached parts can often have the opposite reaction. As they feel closeness at long last, it is both a relief and a trigger. Their fears of abandonment and sensitivity to empathic failure typically intensify, often leading to increasing demands on the therapist's time and energy. If therapists interpret the disorganized attachment as the expression of a whole integrated client, the symptoms are likely to be understood as a personality disorder. Only when the assumption is made that these behaviors represent disorganized attachment associated with structurally dissociated parts can the therapist avoid becoming inducted into the system, whether as rescuer, potential victimizer, or uncaring bystander. Without the conceptual framework of structural dissociation, therapists can easily become confused and frustrated by the alternating appearances of attached parts, expressing needs for more proximity, and flight or fight parts distancing, controlling, or devaluing the treatment. It might be easier to work with submit's willingness to go along with the therapist's agenda, or with the attached part's neediness, than with the resistance or devaluing of fight, or the chronic ambivalence about therapy expressed by the flight part. Without doubt, the therapist will find it more rewarding to work with the normal life part's difficulties with daily functioning than to sit with a mute shutdown freeze part or a fight part in level 4 lockdown mode. The biggest challenge for the therapist is being able to remember that these frustrating, alarming issues are driven by the internal conflicts between parts, rather than automatically assuming that the client is an integrated he or she. When that happens, we are more, rather than less, likely to be drawn into what was an internal struggle. A therapist for all the parts, not just for the client. Most therapists take on a single client, not a motley collection of parts sharing a common body. But since structural dissociation and splitting is statistically likely in the context of trauma, therapists should assume that by taking on any traumatized client, they may be taking on his or her parts too. That means that the therapists must listen, speak, and conduct the treatment somewhat differently than he or she otherwise would in treating more integrated clients, whose early lives did not require splitting and self-alienation. As the therapist meets the client for the first time, hears the presenting issues and takes a history, he or she should already be attuned to the trauma-related themes likely to be echoed by different parts: painful loneliness and the need for connection, despair and self-defeating beliefs, fear and avoidance of being seen. Putting aside what might be viewed as the bigger issue of the client's trauma history, I habitually listen for the subtle indicators of losses of functioning, internal conflicts, self-sabotage, and paradoxical behavior. In addition, I am not thinking of parts as tied to the client's histories. I listen for how the parts' implicit memories are being triggered in the client's current life. Are they being triggered by the client's determination to live a normal life after trauma? By the client's exposure to certain kinds of trauma-related triggers, e.g., a boss who is controlling and critical, a child at an age at which the client was traumatized, family members connected to the perpetrator, or I am listening for some life event that is likely to stir up earlier trauma, such as a loss, betrayal, or recent traumatic event, or even a happy life transition. Becoming the therapist for all the parts begins with listening for their chorus of voices and themes, beginning to name the themes and the parts as they are heard, and evoking the client's curiosity about what has been happening. Most clients come to therapy with a feeling of confusion, desperation, unbearable pain, and unspoken fears that they are losing their minds. Although they may have created a story to explain their bewildering symptoms, the first few visits mark the point in time when they are often most open to hearing a new perspective that reassures them they are not crazy or defective. As I tell them a different story, one that makes sense of what they have experiencing, often the relief is palpable. It is common for clients to have difficulty sustaining access to the going on with normal life self, difficulty feeling empathy for their parts, difficulty maintaining access to the prefrontal cortex, even retaining their initial curiosity about this new way of thinking, because the language of I is an automatic default setting. For most of us, our procedurally learned tendency, when we feel something, is to say, I feel this way. It takes repetition and practice to use the words, a part of me feels this way. As comfortably or automatically, often the therapist feels discouraged by the slow pace or begins to question if the approach is helpful. But it is important to remember that we are changing a kind of learning that is meant to be indelible. Human beings never forget procedural learning. How to shake hands, how to drive a car, how to pick up a knife and fork, and we never lose the tendency to say I. Learning to use the word part instead of I remembering to think in parts language, listening for their different voices. Encouraging curiosity, providing psychoeducation about trauma and trauma treatment, mindful noticing of patterns and themes, and an introduction to the language of triggering are all important, even in a first or intake visit. Even as we are gathering information from a new client, therapists should be listening intently for the voices of the different parts and also for signs of a normal life self, a home, career or job, relationships, interests, some areas of stability, and most importantly, a functioning prefrontal cortex and the capacity to observe what happens moment to moment. The trauma-informed therapist is also alert for signs of dysregulation, either visible in the session or reported by the client. Most human beings are in the habit of assuming that all thoughts, feelings, and physical reactions are mine, that what I am feeling represents my emotions. It takes week after week practice to help clients relinquish that automatic assumption and learn, instead, to assume that anything they might be feeling or thinking could be an expression of any one of many parts. To help individuals reclaim their fragmented, disowned, alienated parts, the therapists must be relentless and persistent in using the language of parts in therapy and asking the client to use it. 2. What happens when you say, "She is feeling ashamed"? Do the feelings get more intense or less? Each time I invite clients to name what they feel as his or her feelings, they noticed a slight relaxing or relief, as if by naming the emotion as his emotion conveys to the part a sense of being heard or being understood. Not only do these patterns need to be noticed and translated into parts language, but it also is important that the therapy emphasize strengthening the normal life self and enhancing the qualities associated with self or self-energy. In the internal family systems approach, Schwartz 201, the normal life self must develop the capacities of wise mind, staying connected to present time, capable of meta-awareness or the capacity to hover above, seeing all of the parts, and the ability to make decisions for the sake of the whole. There are a number of ways to achieve dual awareness, even in very decompensated individuals, but all depend upon multimodal interventions. Because visual focusing seems to increase curiosity and activate the medial prefrontal cortex, trauma therapists can benefit from including an easel or large clipboard as part of their office equipment, as I do. For example, I might ask a client to draw a picture of some part with which he or she has been struggling, and then invite the client to look at the picture with curiosity. What does the drawing tell him about this part? What is he learning from the drawing that challenges what he's previously believed about the part? How does he feel toward this part now. Or we can help clients decode struggles between parts by creating a flowchart that tracks the internal relationships between the parts in conflict, starting with initial trigger and then noting step by step which part or parts were activated. Drawing a rectangle at the top of the page to depict the going on with normal life self. Clients are asked to observe, retrospectively, frame by frame, the sequence of triggers and parts that set the internal conflict in motion. The trigger is usually represented by a large arrow shape that I color in red. Next, the client is asked to recall which part reacted first to the triggering stimulus, and that part is depicted by a circle within which the therapist can write the approximate age or some description of the part, i.e. depressed part, anxious part, by which to recognize it in the future. Cass came carrying a little plastic bag. "Here, these are the parts," she said, and she dumped the contents of her little bag on the table and promptly returned to her internal conversation. A small pile of miniature rubber ducks sat on my coffee table, a gift from Cass representing the parts she couldn't yet tell me about because she was too overwhelmed by their sheer number and the intensity of their feelings and conflicts. Following that session, Cass gradually learned to describe her week-to-week internal problems and conflicts using the ducks, choosing different sizes and colors of little rubber ducks to represent different parts. Weeks later, she even brought in a rubber stress ball in the shape of a human brain to represent that big brain you keep talking about. The somatic communication speaks directly to the parts themselves. The left brain, specializing in words, may react negatively to the verbal communication but cannot block the somatic message intended for the right brain. The younger parts can feel the wing in the drawing and in my gesture. Another means of externalizing the parts' struggles and conflicts so they can be witnessed is to use objects to represent them. Sand tray figurines, animal figures, stones and crystals, even rubber ducks. Notice that all of these figures are appealing to a child's mind, not just an adult mind and body. The therapist must never forget that the client is not a he or she, but is a system composed of parts of all ages from infants to wise elders. Whether achieved through mindful observation, drawing, diagramming, or duck therapy, externalization or visual depiction of the parts in interaction facilitates a wider field of awareness, greater curiosity and interest, a sense of perspective. I'm safe now, even though my parts don't believe it, and increasing capacity to access the better judgment of the wise mind. Dyadic dancing is the term Alan Shore, 201, uses to describe the co-regulation of mother and infant in those interchanges in which They feed off each other's body language, sounds, smiles, and facial expressions. In mutual attunement. This is all right brain language. The success of therapeutic dialogue rests on it feeling like a dyadic dance. In infant dialoguing, each maternal response either soothes or builds excitement, and the attuned caregiver makes sure to track the baby's signals to ensure that the infant is enjoying the exchange, neither over or understimulated. Similarly, the attuned therapist observes the client's body language, tracks what elicits the going on with normal life self's curiosity and interest, what reassures, submit or attach parts, what helps the fight part to feel less phobic of emotion or closeness, what regulates the autonomic nervous system so that the client's body is neither over or understimulated. Dyadic dancing attunement to all parts and to the system as a whole is expressed through the therapist's body. The face softens or looks firm but calm or communicates warmth. The tone becomes one of curiosity, fascination, or determination. The therapist might lean forward or sit back in rhythm with the client. He or she uses the right brain perception to monitor the client's body and nervous system, and then mindfully adjusts breathing, tone of voice, energy level, and facial expression accordingly. Seeing that the client is getting agitated, the therapist slows respiration, slows the pace of speech, and softens the tone. Avoiding questions that require thinking, he or she asks the client to notice the agitation or notice the belief that goes with it. Rather than listening to the entirety of the client's statement or story before replaying, as is the custom in most therapeutic methods, the therapist immediately engages in a duet or dialogue. The client makes an observation, the therapist responds by echoing the words or translating them into parts language. A reaction occurs, hopefully but not necessarily, an increase in curiosity. And the therapist echoes that statement in parts language, makes a bird's eye perspective comment, or asks the client to simply stay mindful and interested. Long filibuster monologues are interrupted and, as often as possible, turned into dialogues centered on shifting the normal life self's attention to the interplay between parts or between parts and triggers. The key to ensuring that clients feel no loss of empathy when they are interrupted or when their words are reinterpreted as a communication from a part is the sensitivity of the attunement. To the degree that the therapist speaks from a place of authentic respect, warmth, and admiration for all the parts, and emphasizes with each point of view the going on with normal life self, can begin to accept each part as a potential resource not just a liability, and a real person worthy of compassion. To do so requires the therapist to speak to and about each part from the point of view of other parts. In this model, the higher level goal of the treatment is the development of increasingly close emotional bonds between the going on with normal life survivor and the young parts that are still afraid, still grieving what they never got, still deeply ashamed and alone. The bonds of internal between parts and normal life self-trust support, trusting the therapist, but more importantly, they support collaboration and consensus. The more the normal life self experiences warm, open, relaxed interest in the parts, the less need for distancing or disconnection from them, especially as clients stabilize. The survival contributions of fight and flight parts must be enthusiastically acknowledged. They must be treated like war veterans. The therapist or client might not believe that the war was necessary or useful, but these parts fought hard for a worthy cause, the survival of the client. So, therapist and client together must honor their service. The submit and freeze parts often benefit from being honored too, although their service consisted of avoidance strategies, freezing, becoming mute, serving others, pleasing and self-sacrifice, floating up to the ceiling. They too were essential to the client's survival and adaptation. Often, the attached part won moments of support from grandparents, teachers, the mothers of friends, neighbors, moments that provided hope, role models, even the belief that they could be loved. Even though these parts still get triggered and continue to drive trauma-related symptoms, the therapist must emphasize: how is this part still trying to help? What is this part worried about? How is this an attempt at a solution? When neither resistance nor escape is possible, the human system of self-defense becomes overwhelmed and disorganized. Each component of the ordinary response to danger, having lost its utility, tends to persist in an altered and exaggerated state long after the actual danger is over. Herman, 1992. Surviving trauma, going on each day as if nothing has happened, coping with both the normal challenges of daily life and the abnormal challenges. Traumatogenic environments all tax an individual's belief in safety and erode the determination to live. Feeling helpless, overwhelmed, inadequate, vulnerable, terrified, and alone, the lived experience is that there is nowhere to turn, nowhere to hide, no one to help. The only resources upon which each individual can draw reside in the body: disconnection, numbing, dissociation, neurochemicals such as adrenaline and endorphins, and the animal defense survival responses of fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attach for survival. These are desperate times requiring desperate measures. We can validate that clients currently have no better way of self-soothing. If we can acknowledge why self-harm or suicidal ideation and self-destructive behavior have been successful in bringing relief, albeit in a paradoxical way, we have the opportunity to develop a collaborative relationship with the client and the fight or flight parts in facing the challenges of relief seeking, rather than reacting immediately to suicidal ideation, active addiction, or self-harm as a safety concern. The therapist should begin by communicating curiosity. What problem might this be a solution for? What triggered this impulse? What is it the client is hoping for as a result of the action? Has he or she found relief in this way previously? When distressed, most children seek connections to others, preferably adults, for soothing, reassurance, or comfort. Those who experience neglect or abuse, however, quickly learn to avoid connection rather than seek it, and to rely almost exclusively on their own resources. Because they cannot trust or depend on others for support, they instinctively seek relief in a variety of behaviors that share one common characteristic. None requires reliance on other human beings. I feel suicidal is an utterance that strikes fear in the heart of any therapist because it implies that the whole being of the client wants to die, that danger is imminent. The TIST model makes a different assumption. It assumes that the wish to suicide reflects the point of view or impulse of one part, but not necessarily all. The question we must ask before jumping to any conclusion is, which I feels suicidal? The depressed part? The suicidal part? What triggered this part or parts? What is driving the impulse or feeling? Once broken down into its component parts, the suicide threat might just mean my little part is really sad and disappointed, and the fight part is trying to prevent her from future rejection by threatening suicide. Or it could mean that the suicidal part has been triggered by the child's tears and frightens her to stop the tears. Or perhaps it means that the depressed part just wants to go to sleep and never wake up again. Each of these answers would require a different solution. Most human beings would agree that criticism is not motivating, that suppressing or blocking feelings results in either depression or anger. Yet, these are often the treatment approaches used with suicidal, self-destructive, eating disorder and addicted clients. The message is, these impulses or behaviors are wrong. They are dangerous, and we are going to help you stop engaging in them. To fight and flight parts, this approach is tantamount to waving the red flag at the proverbial bull. It alienates and polarizes the parts whose trust we most want to win, whose motives we want to understand. It can undermine a normal life self, who is sincerely trying to work with treatment providers but keeps being told she or he is not trying hard enough. Traditional treatments for these issues typically focus on cessation of unsafe behavior, thereby alienating and polarizing the fight and flight parts and often jeopardizing stabilization. Similarly, shame, exhaustion, and self-doubt are most often treated as indications of chronic depression or low self-esteem, rather than understood as communications from parts who bear the burden of submission and humiliation. What happens with your children if you try to ignore them when they're upset or scared? The response is always, they get more upset. That's why you can't ignore them. Then I can suggest, yes, you are absolutely right, and just like your kids, these child parts inside get more scared when you try to ignore them. What would you do if they were your biological children? It is important for the therapist to remember that what happens outside each session is just as important as what happens during the therapy, especially for fragmented individuals with histories of trauma. It is important to be attentive to how they carry the work of therapy past the hour. Touching moments of heart-to-heart connection between a small child part and a compassionate adult self are important, but to facilitate the shift from internal alienation to earned secure attachment is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. As the saying goes, repetition over and over again of the same steps, connecting to a part, creating moments of repair and attunement, and deepening the bond between child and adult selves, and then integrating the experience. Without efforts to repair emotional ruptures, bring solace to parts in distress, and combat self-alienation and self-loathing with internal attachment bonding, traumatized clients cannot feel whole, safe, and welcome. Deeply felt self-acceptance and self-compassion can only develop when our young, wounded parts experience the safety of a here and now adult's unconditional attachment to them, when they sense that they now have a protector and advocate. The therapist must shoulder responsibility for keeping in mind the ultimate purpose of the work, repairing the implicit memories of early attachment rupture being communicated by the part's shame, fear, sadness, anger, or emotional pain. Although each client and each part is unique, each manifestation of internal self-alienation subtly different, the building blocks of internal attachment repair remain the same. As the client reports emotional distress, negative thoughts, or physical reactions to a trigger, the therapist asks the client to recognize these symptoms as a part. When those aspects of ourselves that have been unconsciously refused are returned, when they are made conscious, accepted, tolerated, or integrated, the self can then be at one, the need to maintain the self-conscious edifice disappears, and the force of compassion is automatically unleashed. The habit of mindful noticing creates a little space between the young child and a wise adult who finds it much easier to be curious now that he or she is less overwhelmed. Cause and effect relationships become clearer. The client feels less crazy when overreactions are reframed as normal reactions of traumatized children. Now the client can observe the influence of the parts on their actions and reactions, and practice being aware of impulses to blend and make a conscious choice. If I blend with the despair of the depressed part, it will upset the little parts and trigger the suicidal part. Maybe I don't want to give in to the feeling of hopelessness after all. With a conscious, voluntary separation from trauma-related parts and a more regulated nervous system, clients begin to develop less aversion and more compassion for them, or at least perspective toward them. The next few quotes are from this book, Dr. Ellen Shore, Right Brain Psychotherapy. The latest groundbreaking interdisciplinary work from one of our most eloquent and significant writers about emotion and the brain, an exploration into the adaptive functions of the emotional right brain, which describes not only affect and affect regulation within minds and brains, but also the communication and interactive regulation of affects between minds and brains. This book offers evidence that emotional interactions reflect right brain to right brain affective communication, essential reading for those trying to understand one-person psychology as well as two-person psychology relationships, whether clinical or otherwise. An interpersonal neurobiology of human development enables us to understand that the structure and function of the mind and brain are shaped by experiences, especially those involving emotional relationships. Ellen Shore. Social interactions between brains shape emotional circuits within brains, especially in early critical periods when brain circuits are maturing. More specifically, I continue to offer evidence in this book, Right Brain Psychotherapy, and the companion volume, The Development of the Unconscious Mind, that emotional interactions reflect right brain to right brain affective communication in early development, where the mother shapes limbic autonomic circuits in the infant's early developing right hemisphere. The essential right brain functions of communication and interactive regulation thus refer to two-person psychobiological interaction as expressed in dynamic interpersonal and intersubjective contexts. An interpersonal neurobiology of human development enables us to understand that the structure and function of the mind and brain are shaped by experiences, especially those involving emotional relationships, and to understand the relational mechanisms by which communicating brains align and synchronize their neural activities with other brains. Actually, the latter principle of interbrain synchronization is more fundamental. It acts as an underlying reciprocal psycho-neurobiological mechanism by which minds and brains are shaped by other minds and brains. Neuroscience itself has been undergoing a paradigm shift. This paradigm shift is expressed in advances in brain research from previous studies of a single brain to recent technologies that allow for simultaneous measurement of two brains interacting with each other in real time. I will suggest that the current shift from a one-person to a two-person theoretical perspective can generate an overarching integrated model of the interactive relationships of the dual brain hemispheres and of the unconscious and conscious minds.